Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks for the invite to join this. I must admit to a slight bit of nervousness about doing this. I've stood up and sung for my supper on one or two occasions, but this is the first time that I've tried to attempt to talk to a blank screen for 35 or 40 minutes at a go. So we'll see how it goes, and hopefully it all works.
If you talk.
Oh, sorry. Okay, and this, as you perhaps gathered from the website, is a story about a little journey through Norway I did a few years ago. And like most journeys, or good journeys, it started with a dream. And this particular dream had its origins way back in 1982, when as a young naval lieutenant, I was on a ship in refit in Portsmouth, and as a deck officer, there's not too much to do when you're in refit. And I managed to persuade the captain to let me take off for a couple of weeks with some of my sailors. And we went off to the British Outward Bound Centre, which was in Kristiansand on the southern end of Norway, where amongst other things, they had the two Cornish Shrimpers you can see in this picture here. So the deal was the six of us turned up there. They gave us these two boats, a wad of money, and said, go and buy yourself some food with that and disappear for 2 weeks. We don't want to see you. Just don't get into trouble and bring the boats back in one piece at the end of it. Well, we took them to their word. We sailed from Kristiansand, got almost all the way up to Norway, all the way up to Oslo and back again, and had a ball. And I think that was the start of a long love affair with Norway, and not just the blonde visions of loveliness that live there. Because later that year in winter, I went back and learnt how to ski in Norway, and have then been going back pretty much every year since then, often twice a year, do a ski trip in winter and go sailing in the summer. And over the course of many trips, I've done quite a bit of poring over maps, and one of the first things you notice if you look about a map in Norway is there's a spine of mountains that runs pretty much all the way from north to south along the country. And I sort of got into a school of thought as I was musing, well, wouldn't it be fun if we started in the south and actually headed up to the north and skied through the mountains, and all these little bits I'd done over the years, join them up in one big piece. And then the dream progressed a little further, because we thought, well, once you got up to the north, you've somehow got to get back home. So, and there's an awful lot of quite nice coastline in Norway, so why don't we just get in a boat and try sailing back round to complete the circumnavigation. And the dreaming didn't quite end there, because at the time I happened to be living in Plymouth, and we had to get to the start somehow. So the next bit to get tagged on was, well, why don't we sail from Plymouth up to the start, do the skiing, and then sail back to where we finished from. Well, that was the dream. But if we were to make that dream come true, then the first thing we needed was a boat to do it in. And I suspect if I did a straw poll of people listening in on this call tonight as to what sort of boat is most suitable for a trip like that, there would probably be as many different answers from an audience, an OCC audience, as there are people in the audience. But I think the one thing that the answers would all have in common is that people will probably be recommending something a bit more like the boat you can see in the background of this picture, and not the one in the foreground. The only problem was the one in the foreground was the one I happened to have, and I certainly didn't have the money in the bank to get the one in the background. So if we were going to do this, it was going to be in that rather diminutive 19-foot shrimper that you can see in the picture there. And I think this was at the point at which most of my sailing friends finally thought I'd lost the plot and gone barking mad. Because if we go back to the map of Norway again and look at what it was we were trying to achieve, just put in the Arctic Circle there, well over a third of the sailing was going to be north of the Arctic Circle, and on our northernmost point we were going to be way up at 72 north. We were planning on starting this trip, or the sailing part of it, sometime in April, so still in spring. I I think most of them thought that you really didn't want to be anywhere near that in a 19-foot shrimper. But actually, if you start looking at the maps of Norway a little more closely, it's not quite as crazy as it seems. The Norwegian coastline isn't just a straight coastline as anyone's been there. It's a massive maze of islands. And if you start zooming in on this, you know, on the maps even further and start looking at the charts, then this is a pretty typical chart for most of the western Norwegian coast. And as a sailor, you might look at that and say, well, that's not the sort of place that I want to be taking my boat in amongst that maze of rocks. But actually, there are pretty well defined paths through that, and you can perfectly well sail a boat through there, provided you stick to the markers. And if we look at what that actual piece of coastline looks like in practice, you have got an abundance of sticks, markers, posts, vards that will actually safely guide you through those rocks, and provided you can keep track of them, you can get safely through that lot. But more importantly, as far as we were concerned, in a 19-foot boat, these rocks actually give you an awful amount of flat water, and it's perfectly possible to get from the north to the south of Norway by only venturing out to sea. I think there are 5 exposed headlands you've got to get round. None of them involve a journey much more than 10 or 15 miles, so you can pick a weather window to get round them and do the rest of the journey in relatively sheltered water. So the plan wasn't quite as crazy as it looked at first sight. So we had the dream, we had the boat. The next thing was some sort of a plan as to how this was going to work. And this was the point at which things started to go pear-shaped, because we're now back in 2003. I sort of got it in my mind that we would spend the spring of 2003 getting the boat ready and doing all that was needed to do for a trip like this. But unfortunately, Messrs. Blair and the American president had slightly different ideas, because far from finding myself in Plymouth at the beginning of April, I actually found myself on the road leading into Basra, putting on a uniform that I thought I'd left behind 5 years ago, being recalled to service to have a little shindig in the desert. When I expressed some concern to my boss that this was going to seriously mess up my sailing plans for the year, he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This will all be done and dusted in 3 or 4 weeks, and you can go home and do your sailing." Well, as we all know, things didn't quite work out like that. And the end result was I actually arrived back in UK right at the beginning of the August of 2013, and this left us, 2003, and this left us with a bit of a problem, because August was getting pretty late in the season. There certainly wasn't too much time to do any planning, and it was very much do we go or don't we go. And I've had this horrible feeling that if I put it off for a year, something else might go wrong the following year. So we made the decision to go. And I show you this next picture not because it's got any great artistic merit, but because it is the picture that greeted our eyes as we sailed out of Plymouth Sound. But it's also pretty much like the state of planning was at that stage. It was a pretty blank canvas. I'd got someone on board who'd agreed to stay with me as far as Brighton, and I think I'd got charts that would get me to Dover. But that literally was the limit of the planning. And I think even by Tillman's standards, who once I think famously said that any good expedition could have been planned on the back of a cigarette packet, I think even he might have balked at the lack of planning that was going into this. But so be it. That was the plan we had or didn't have. The journey was underway, and we were setting off from Plymouth. The one thing we did have at the beginning of the trip in abundance was plenty of wind, and it was off behind us, which was a good job because shrimpers don't go to windward terribly well. But we made very fast progress up the English Channel on what was actually the most exposed part of the entire trip. And a week after this picture was taken, we were locking into the Dutch canal system in Vlissingen, and things were starting to look altogether a tiny bit more promising. We'd got the worst of the open sea passage out of the way before any nasty weather had come in. In the interim, I've managed to sort out various friends to come and crew for us to get us up the various legs to Norway. And we then set up through the canals, heading northwards towards Amsterdam, being Holland, lots of windmills on the way, lots of lovely little fortress towns like this in Zierikzee, where you could lock right into the heart of the city centre. And we spent about 3 days, 4 days going up through the canals until we finally got into the flesh pots of Amsterdam. Spent a couple of days there, and from there headed out from Amsterdam north into the IJsselmeer, the big inland sea just to the north of there, which was full of wonderful Dutch barges and schooners and one or two smaller boats like this one here, which we came across in the town of Edam, famous for its cheese, and we just happened to hit it as the cheese festival was starting, and there was an awful lot of cheese being thrown around ashore, which made for a fun short stop. From Edam, it was then out of the IJsselmeer into Riddle of the Sands country, and whilst there may have been quite a few boats there, there wasn't an awful lot of water around, as you can perhaps see from the people paddling around the boat at anchor there, with the water barely getting above their ankles. And as anyone who's read Riddle of the Sands or sailed in the area knows, tides are king here. Spent a lot of time poring over tide tables in the cockpit and working out best time to leave, which invariably seemed to make for lots of early morning starts. But this was probably the first time in the trip that actually being in a small boat seemed like quite a good idea, because if you take the inland passage through the Frisian Islands, the channels are all very narrow, extremely shallow, and generally speaking all marked by wooden withies like the one you can see there. Just bring the arrow in. And the strategy we sort of adopted was you would set off on the flood tide, and we'd motor up the channels slowly until the depth progressively got lower and lower, until even with our lifting keel and draft of 0.3 meters, we would gently run aground. Then we'd just stop, paddle around the boat, do a bit of sunbathing, wait for a bit more tide to come in, inch a bit further up the channel, and keep going until you get to the watershed, which you hopefully reach on the top of the tide, and then a quick dash once you're over the watershed down to try and get back into deeper water before the tide runs out on you. So that was our fun in the IJsselmeer. From there, we went through the Kiel Canal into the Baltic, where once again we started to feel like a very small boat fishing in a big pond. Through the Danish islands up to Copenhagen, and from Copenhagen northwards past Helsingør, the castle that's I think reputed to be the one that features in Shakespeare's Hamlet, and then into probably what was the most spectacular part of the trip, the Bohuslän Peninsula, which is the chain of islands that lies just to the north of Gothenburg, very similar to the Norwegian coast, hundreds and thousands of small islands there. Navigationally quite challenging, and a lot of time was spent under the boom tent at night, armed with a head torch and good old-fashioned paper charts, working out a route through all these little islands. But in the end, we needn't have worried too much, because the Swedish were incredibly helpful, because on an awful lot of rocks we saw signs like this telling us which way we'd come from and where we needed to go to get to Oslo. And I think if you can see the one on the side there, it even has the way to New York if we wanted to go there. Well, it was now the beginning of September, and we'd actually reached the entrance to Oslo Fjord, and a couple of days later we were in Oslo itself, tied up at the King's Yacht Club, and it was a beautifully calm, clear day. The water was mirror calm, but we only had to look around us to realize that autumn was well and truly on the way, and when we looked at the Norwegian weather forecast that night, the forecast was for gales or storms in most areas covered by this forecast. So you can probably see from the date at the top, it was the 13th of September. We had just about made it in the nick of time before winter came in. Well, that was the end of the first leg. We'd got to Norway. The next part was the sailing leg, the skiing leg, which we had a little bit of a wait for because the snow hadn't arrived yet. For this, I was joined by a friend of mine who I had met many years ago skiing up in Norway. He'd managed to wangle himself 4 months off work from Friends of the Earth, where he was an environmental campaigner, and he said, "Oh, I'll join you for this." So when I mentioned to my friends that we were planning on going skiing for 4 months in Norway, I think they all thought that I'd somehow won the lottery, because anyone who could afford 4 months of après-ski beers in Norway certainly had to be rich. But I had to disappoint them, because this was not skiing of the piste variety. It was definitely all going to be off-piste. And I think in the entire trip we came across one ski lift, and the ethics of what we were doing meant we didn't take the drag lift up. We actually ended up skiing up the slope itself. The other thing we had to take into account was when to actually start this ski trip. And we'd sort of asked a few Norwegians, well, you know, if you were going to do this, when's the best time to go? And they all to a man said, you don't want to start skiing in the Norwegian mountains until at least February, maybe even beginning of March, because before that time it will simply be far too cold and the weather will be far too stormy. So yeah, leave it late, they said. Well, that might be okay for a Norwegian who can ski 10 million miles an hour and can quite happily ski from north to, or from south to north in a space of a month and a half. But at the pace us mere mortal Brits could ski, we'd pretty much worked out that if we didn't leave, sort of end of December, early January, there was no way we were going to get to the north before the snow ran out. So we decided to disregard the local advice, and we set off finally on the 23rd of December. And I'm going to take a little break from talking now and hope that this video works. Simon, if it isn't coming in or is coming in completely corrupted, can you give a shout and just stop me, and we'll just be to the next.
Just be aware, Clive, that sometimes we lose the audio altogether from you at these times. So if everything goes very silent at your end, that means you probably have to reconnect completely. But,
okay.
Fingers crossed. Looking forward to a bit of techie wizardry.
Yeah. If it all goes badly wrong, just give us a call on the phone, and I'll. Because I can't. I'm in full screen mode here, so I can't actually see whether people are looking puzzled or not at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll make sure I've got your number, but go on and give it a go.
Okay, then here we go.
It's now the 21st of December in the heart of the Telemark Mountains. We're just about to start our trip northwards. As you can see, it has snowed during the night. The weather is pretty foul, but too cloud on top, but we're starting our Nordic Odyssey. So this is day one, and we're rolling. There is freedom within. There is freedom without. We touch down to the there's a battle ahead. Many battles are lost, but you never see the end of the road by your side. Don't dream it.
There's a hole in the room. I'm searching through walls and suspicious events. Funny parts of still some water and waves. Turn right on to the chamber.
How long has it taken us to get out of the valley bottom?
So a day and sort of 2 hours now, just to go about 4 kilometres. So probably gives you some idea of what the going's been like.
Clive, that worked very well, I think. The sound was a little psychedelic, but the video was fine. And quite why you towed those pulks up those hills, I really don't know, but back to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, a very carefully selected piece of video there, most of it that was shot within the first few days. And if you did manage to see or hear any of it, it probably gave you the impression that we spent an awful lot of time wading through very thick, heavy snow, and on occasions, getting bogged down in it. Actually, that was a little bit misleading because once we got up onto the mountains themselves, the biggest problem we faced was actually a distinct lack of winter. It really had only snowed for the first time on the 20th December, which is pretty unusual for Norway, and temperatures had been abnormally warm. This picture that you can see here was taken once we did get out above the tree line and up onto the Norwegian mountain plateau. And I don't know whether you can see, I'll bring an arrow in on the here. We're actually following a river course here, which normally at this time of year we would have expected to have had about 3 or 4 foot of ice on the river and a good 2 or 3 foot of snow at least on top of that. The reality was there was probably a couple of inches of ice on there and barely any snow. And this was a theme that was to be repeated for much of the first 2 or 3 weeks. And we had some quite hairy moments negotiating only barely frozen rivers and lakes, of which there are many hundreds and thousands in the Norwegian mountains. And we weren't always completely successful in negotiating them. The ones that you can see in this picture were nice and easy to avoid. What was slightly less easy was where you had perhaps a 1/4 inch of ice on the water, and then the rest of it covered by a thin dusting of snow that we thought we could ski across, and then suddenly got very wet. And seen in the tents at night for the first 2 or 3 weeks, this was pretty representative. If we had our little primer stove going and was spending an awful lot of time trying to dry out wet boots and wet gloves. And the temperatures were pretty consistently above 0, but not always. And this was when the problems really came, because every 4 or 5 days or so, a big cold snap seemed to come in with temperatures plummeting down from about +5 down to -25. And life in the tent then got extremely difficult because everything was soaking wet. Even our little bonfires with the primer stove wasn't really managing to keep the boots and gloves dry. And although we were sleeping with them in plastic bags inside of our sleeping bags to try and keep them as dry as we could, they might just about be thawed by the time we put them on in the morning, but by the time we got out into -25, it didn't take too long before they were frozen solid. And by the end of the first 7, 8, 9 days, this was what our heels were looking like, and this was what our fingers were beginning to look like. And for those that haven't seen that before, that's first signs of frostbite. Now, at this point, I would forgive you if you're saying, well, the Norwegians were right. You don't go into the mountains that early in the season. It's pretty crazy. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Actually, there are some upsides to it. And one of the upsides of going skiing that early in the season in high latitudes is the light. You don't get too much daylight a day, and the sun never gets very high in the sky. But when it does rise, you get some fantastic dawns. And this was typical of a sky you would see in December or early January, about an hour before sunrise. And then as you get closer to sunrise, you get some fantastic light displays like this one here, which almost looks like the mountains are erupting as volcanoes. The other plus side of going into the mountains at that time of the year is you really do have them completely to yourselves. The Norwegians stay true to their own advice. They won't venture into the mountains. And the only thing I think we saw for the first month and a half we were up there were big herds of reindeer like this, but no other people. And it wasn't always tense. Those that have traveled in the mountains in Norway will know that they've got one of the best chains of mountain huts in the world. And these are quite distinct from mountain huts that I've come across anywhere else, and certainly very, very distinct from the alpine hut system. These are all, with a very few exceptions, they're all completely unmanned. They're run on an honesty basis. There's no booking of them. You join the Norwegian Mountain Hut Association, you get issued a key, and this key will get you into any one of 300 or 400 of these mountain huts, which are scattered through the Norwegian mountains. So on the occasions we were able to stay in them, we very definitely did. They're fully equipped with firewood, so you can get a good fire going once you're inside. They've got kitchens, and even some of the ones in the south have even got food in them that you can again buy on an honesty basis, cook it yourself. And we wasted no time on the occasions when we were staying in the huts in replacing all the lost calories that we'd lost during the day. Every 7 or 8 days or so, we would come down out of the mountains and drop down into some picture postcard towns like this, little Norwegian villages, just to stock up on food again, and then head back up into the mountains for the next week-long leg or so. By the time we got to middle of January, end of January, things were looking an awful lot brighter. The days were getting longer. The weather was getting better. We'd spent the first 4 weeks without actually seeing anything. We were almost continuously skiing in mist and fog. But by January, that had cleared, and we had some wonderfully stellar, clear, beautiful mountain days. We were in a region of Norway where the huts were starting to get closer and closer together. Typically, they're sort of 20 to 25 kilometers apart. So an easy day skiing. So we were having to resort to the tent less. The mountains were getting steeper and even more spectacular. And still, we had the mountains completely to ourselves. We still yet to see another person in the mountains. Just as we thought the worst was over, we then got hit with a rude surprise, because in the middle of February, which traditionally one would expect to perhaps be the coldest month of the year in Norway, the temperatures suddenly soared up to about +5, and they stayed that way for the best part of 2 or 3 weeks. And it didn't take too long before the snow was going from the mountains, and this was pretty much what we were doing, carrying skis rather than skiing on them. Now, that wasn't necessarily a problem in the mountains, at least we could walk. But by this stage, we were in the middle of Norway, which is the lowest lying part. And one of the characteristics of this part of Norway is they have got an awful lot of ex-glacial lakes that need to be crossed. And when we got to the first of these and got to the edge of it, this was the scene that greeted our eyes, or rather greeted our skis. We were sort of teetering on the edge there, and you can possibly see from the picture that there was enough water there on the top of the lake to cover the tops of our ski tips. And this was a little bit of a problem as far as we were concerned, because almost all these glacial lakes run on an east-west axis. We were skiing south to north. To ski across the lake was about half a kilometre, provided it was frozen. But if we had to ski round them, then that would have made a 40 or 50 kilometre diversion in each case, which wasn't something we were terribly enthused about. But when we got to this first apparently unfrozen lake, we did see a couple of Norwegian fishermen. You can perhaps see their little, they were ice fishing there. You can perhaps see the little rod at the foot of the rucksack. And we asked them, what's the deal? Is there any way we can get across this lake? And they said, yeah, no problem at all. We've come across it on our snow scooter, our skidoo. It's perfectly safe to ski across it. So it didn't really look it to us, but we thought, well, always believe the locals. And we set off. I must admit, it felt like we got water skis on rather than snow skis. You can probably see the spray coming up from the skis. But by the time we had got to the middle of the lake, we were beginning to have severe misgivings about this advice we'd been given, because there were some awfully large cracks appearing in this ice. And about 30 seconds after this picture was taken, the pictures stopped. And the reason they stop is that one of us had actually fallen through this ice, and we were up to our chests in water. Well, we somehow managed to scrabble out and get across the ice and got to the other shore. There was fortunately a hut there, and we were joined as we were drying out later on that evening by the Norwegians, and we recounted this story to them, and they just laughed, and we thought this was a little bit uncharitable, to put it mildly. But they then went on to explain that actually we'd been in no danger whatsoever because of a phenomenon that we've been blissfully unaware of called double ice. And they went on to say that it was fairly usual in this part of Norway to get a freeze at the beginning of the winter season, and the lakes would freeze over. And then they'd have a warm spell, and rain would come along, and it would float on top of the ice. And then they would have another freeze and a layer of ice on top of that. And what you end up having is 2 layers of ice with a sandwich of water in the middle. And what we had actually done was just fallen through the top layer of the sandwich into the water. But they assured us that the bottom level was at least 3 meters thick, and that we were never in any real danger. So that was reassuring to know. So we crossed the remaining lakes with a little less trepidation. And by the beginning of March, we had reached the Arctic Circle. We were beginning to climb up higher, getting out of the tree line, which was a good job, because skiing through the trees may sound very romantic when you're on downhill skis, but when you're on skinny cross-country planks, the climbing through the tree line usually means lots of thick, uncompacted snow and lots of getting tangled up in trees. So we were pretty glad to get back up onto the high mountain plateaus again, and out onto the mountains of Troms and northern Norway, which are even more remote, wild and spectacular than some of the mountains in the south of the country. And this is pretty typical of the scenery that we were skiing through for much of March there, and still had the mountains completely to ourselves, no one else out there. By the second week in March, we had reached what was really the last barrier between us and the sea. It was the Finnmark Plateau, vast, open, very flat plateau, largely inhabited by the reindeer you can see here, and the Sami who herd them. And we reckoned we would have about 4 or 5 days to cross this, and then we would be, we'd have reached the destination. But again, things didn't quite go according to plan, because although we were still middle of March, we were by this stage, a couple of 100 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. The temperatures during the daytime were spiking up to about plus 25 degrees C. And the biggest problem we were facing then was pretty much heat exhaustion and dehydration. And we found ourselves stopping every hour or so to get the stove out, melt a little more snow just to keep ourselves hydrated. But that was just one of the problems that were facing us. The other problem was that that heat was turning the snow to absolute porridge. And we went from a stage where before then we had been quite comfortably skiing 30, 40, sometimes even 50 kilometers in a day on the hard compacted spring snow. But once we got into this melted porridge, we were struggling to do more 4 or 5K in a day. And we got about halfway across the Finnmark plateau. And yeah, we'd pretty much run out of food and run out of options, because the only option was to keep going. So we turned nocturnal. We tried to cross any rivers that needed crossing at night. We skied by the light of the northern lights and the moon, and just simply kept going to get off the plateau where we get some food. When we got to the other end, this was the view that greeted our eyes. The heat wave had taken its toll. It was pretty clear we were gone as far as we were going to go on skis. They became a redundant piece of kit, and for the final 20 kilometers of the journey into Lakselv, it was skis on back and a walk down a rather hard, tiring concrete road to the sea. And sorry, skip slide there. When we got to the sea, we promised ourselves 2 things. One, we were going to go for a swim in it. The second was that we were going to treat ourselves to a nice big beer. Actually, we weren't able to do either of those 2. The snow may have gone in the mountains, but unfortunately the sea was still frozen in the fjord in Lakselv, so we didn't get our swim in. And worse still, we'd managed to time our arrival for Easter weekend, and the whole of the place had shut down, so there wasn't a bar in sight anywhere, or a restaurant or a hotel open to get the beer. So we had to do without that as well. So, but we had got to the end. That was the end of the next chapter. We had a little pause then, because after the ski we had to wait for the sea to thaw before we could get the boat back into the water. But it didn't take too long in those temperatures before it had thawed. We towed the Shrimper up from Oslo on a trailer. We were lifted into the water by a builder's truck, and despite the fact that by now I think we were almost 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, it was still relatively early in April. The weather was like being in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. You can see from the short sleeves there, this really was not Arctic weather. The theme continued. This was our first night at anchor. That was the last time we saw the sun coming anywhere near setting for the next couple of months. But things changed quickly in this part of the world, and just a few hours after that picture was taken, when we woke up the next morning, this was the scene that had greeted our eyes. Winter had made a comeback with a vengeance. We did try doing a bit of sailing, but really a shrimper is not the sort of boat to be out in when a winter blizzard is blowing up there. So we just hunkered down, treated it like a little bit of a snow cave, caught up on the blog and sat the storms out. It lasted for about 6 or 7 days before we were able to break out. We got around North Cap and were then into the coastline of the northern Troms coastline, with wonderful snow-capped mountains down to the water. But the thing I would probably remember about that more so than the mountains was the absolute clarity of the water, because if you look down, this was how crystal clear the water was. And what you're seeing there is not black weed. Those are actually small cod there. A complete profusion of fish at that time of year. Likewise, the anchorages, you may think on seeing this slide that we've just done a fast forward down to the Med or to the Caribbean, but this was pretty typical of the anchorages up on the North Troms coast. lovely sandy beaches, and it was only when you looked the other way and saw the snow-capped mountains behind you that you realized you still were in the Arctic. Next stop from Troms was down into the Lofoten Islands, famous for their fishing, and having arrived just after the fishing season, there's an awful lot of cod around hanging out on the wrecks, drying out, ready to be shipped down to Portugal and all sorts of other places that love bacalhau. And it also provided us with some very spectacular sailing through some through the mountains of the Lofoten. Once we were south of the Lofoten, the island scenery started getting a bit softer. But the one thing we did continue to enjoy was consistent tailwinds, and this was one of the plus points about starting sailing from the north very early in the season, is that all other things being equal, you're very much likely to enjoy the polar high for much of the first early months of the season. So we had northerly winds blowing us pretty much all the way down the Norwegian coast. And I think in the whole 1600 mile trip, we had to tack 3 times. Most of the time we were running behind the wind, or running before the wind, in conditions like the ones you can see in this picture here. As we got south, the anchorages were still as beautiful as they were in the north, and again, this looks almost like it could be somewhere in the Mediterranean, not up in Arctic Norway. Occasionally we'd go alongside, and this is what passes as a crowded marina in that part of the world. And there was also an abundance of wildlife. On this particular Vard here, it was very rare that you went past a Vard without seeing at least 1 or 2 sea eagles on. And a couple of moments after we had passed by this one here, they took off in flight, dived down into the water, and I don't know whether you can see in the yellowish talons underneath there, there's actually a nice big fat cod under there. They managed to just scoop up out of the water, and we thought, well, if a sea eagle can do that, we'll have a go. Fishing can't be too bad here. Even idiots like us might be able to get something. So we dangled a bit of nylon over the side, and this really was fishing for idiots, because you couldn't go wrong. I mean, literally 30 seconds after putting a line with a couple of hooks on, we had a bucket full of cod, and later on that night, or that evening, we were sitting on the rocks, grilling it on a barbecue, with even a glass of very expensive Norwegian beer there. There were occasions when we had to venture outside one of the notorious Norwegian headlands, this one here, Stat, where it very definitely wasn't mirror calm, and one needed to pick our weather. It did induce a look of sheer terror in our crew as we went around 1 or 2 of these, but they were only very short-lived. And as we started to get further south in Norway, we started to leave behind anchorages like this and spent slightly more time in the big towns and cities of the south. And rather than seeing fishing trawlers or whale hunters like this one, you can perhaps see the harpoon gun on the front. Instead, we were seeing more oil rigs and oil rig support vessels. So we knew that slowly but surely we were getting back into civilization. But it wasn't to end on a complete low, because we still had one thing left that we wanted to do. Once we had got round the southern tip of Norway, we wanted to actually get back to the point where we had started skiing. And we sailed into the Telemark Canal, which runs just from the south of Norway, just about 100 kilometers south of Oslo, and runs right into the heart of the Norwegian mountains. So we locked in through the locks, and then up into a series of connected lakes that took us all the way up to Dalen, which was where we had started skiing some 7 months earlier. Well, that was the point at which we started to de-store the boat. She was lifted out of the water. By that stage, I'd had so much time off work, I couldn't justify sailing back down to Plymouth, and that was all going to be against the wind and a little hard work. So she was lifted out of the water. This time we had got our timing a little better and were able to enjoy a pint of beer to celebrate the completion of the trip. And I think with that beer, that's probably a good point to stop, because we'd actually got back to where we started, the circle had been squared, and we'd lived the dream. With that, I will stop talking, but I'm delighted to take any questions if there are any.
Well done, Clive.
Oh, gosh, that was a marathon. Difficult to do when you haven't got an audience to look at, but
Clive, that was fantastic. Thank you very, very much indeed. It was a wonderful combination of kind of eccentricity, hard sweat and toil. Those mountain scenes looked absolutely fabulous, and doing it all in a 19-foot boat just looked idyllic. I'm sure there were pretty woolly days when you were coming down when the camera didn't come out in the boat, but it looked fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask people. Actually, there's no questions being logged, so I'd ask people to log their questions, because we've got 50-odd people online, and I don't want to go for a free-for-all just yet. But a few simple questions from me, Clive, if I may. I mean, pulks and rucksacks. How much were you carrying? I guess the pulk seemed to disappear halfway through or something. How did you manage that?
It did, and that was the happiest day of the trip. The logic behind it, we started off with pulks and tents because at the beginning of the trip, at the beginning of the season, we knew the snow would be softer, and that there was a very real chance that we would not be able to ski far enough at that time of year when the days were short and the snow was soft to make a hut every night. So, and if you're going to ski with a tent and all the stove and fuel that was needed with it, you really, a pulk is a more efficient way of doing that than putting it on your back. In retrospect, it was a big mistake, because it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we were tailoring this bloody pulk. It ensured we didn't ski very far, and we ended up having to use the tent. In retrospect, if we'd had a bit more confidence in our ability at the beginning and skied light and fast, actually there were enough huts around that we could have done the entire trip without the pulk. And by the end, by the halfway trip, we'd sort of learnt that lesson, got rid of it, left it, abandoned it in a lodge, and picked it up on the way home. And life became altogether far more pleasant after that. And I never ever want to ski with a pulk behind me again, unless it's strict.
That's a very wise decision. We've got a question from Rowena Carlson. Rowena, do you want to open your microphone and come in?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a CCA member. I wonder what kind of speed you can make in the Shrimper.
If the wind's behind you and you've got 20, 25 knots of wind, we were doing 5 to 6 knots quite happily. If you've got wind on the nose, then yes, you just stay in harbour, because with a lifting keel and a diminutive little inboard motor on there, you go nowhere. But so it was very much gentleman sailing. We picked our days. If the wind was against us, you simply didn't bother trying. But absolutely no reason why you can't, do a big trip in a small boat.
This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. We've got a question from Bill Weagle. Bill, do you want to come in? Bill, can you hear me? Can you open your microphone, and or shall I read the question out to Clive? So nothing heard from Bill there, Clive, but the question is, given changes in backcountry ski gear and lighter equipment and climbing skins, what type of skis would you use if you were going to do it all over again?
Actually, exactly the same, because though the skis we used there were, yeah, that they were at the time that they were sort of pretty much when I say market leading. One of the big innovations in backcountry skiing has been from moving away from full length skins on the ski, which made skiing pretty slow, to skins that were embedded and only took up half the length of it and could be detached when you didn't need them. And there were some little keys on the bottom of those skis that allowed you to put these half-length skis on. So at the time we did those trips, they literally were an innovation. We were sponsored by Asnes, who made the skis and gave them to us to really try out for the first time. And yeah, that they were a fantastic success, and they've moved on to the point now where even racing skis now, that there are ones that have got skins on the bottom of them as opposed to using wax. So actually, in that sense, what we were using then is pretty much the industry standard now. They haven't got any better. We weren't on thick, heavy plastic boots. It was very, very lightweight gear, and skiing 40 or 50 kilometers a day, provided the snow was yeah, hard and compacted, was no big deal at all.
And of course, they doubled as water skis on a couple of occasions as well, which was probably beyond their design limit. How did the whole thing, in terms of effort and endurance, compared to your other big ski trip, which I think was crossing the Greenland ice cap, wasn't it?
I mean, it clearly was longer, but the crossing the Greenland ice cap was sheer mental torture. Nothing more, nothing less, and that involved, yeah, a completely different order of magnitude. We were towing pulks with almost 200 kilos in there because of the fuel, and was the most featureless. It was like crossing an ocean there. You imagine you're skiing through mountains, but you're not. You see mountains on the first day of crossing, you see them on the last day, and in the middle, although you're going from sea level up to almost 10,000 feet above sea level and back down again, the incline is so slow that you're effectively skiing on a big white open plateau, and it's boring, it's hard, and it's mentally very difficult. The Norway trip, in comparison, was a breeze. There was, there was always something to keep you interested, motivated. Everything was always changing, and I'd do it tomorrow if I could get the time off work to do it.
They look absolutely gorgeous. The scenery looked wonderful. We've got a question from Jose Fernandez. It just says I, but Jose, do you want to open your microphone and ask your question? Hello, can you go ahead? Okay, nothing heard. So we haven't got any more questions listed. If people want to open a microphone, and we'll go for a bit of a free for all. We've still got 46 people online, so that can be a bit chaotic. But has anybody got any questions they want to ask using their microphone?
Hi, yeah, Martin Doble here. Just wondering if was 2004 a really bad year to choose, or is that the new normal in Norway?
At the time, it felt like it wasn't a good year, and certainly not for snow conditions and skiing conditions. But yeah, I think the in phrase today would be to call it the new normal, because having been back there since, the one thing that is consistent is the inconsistency of it, and planning a ski trip in the Norwegian mountains now has become infinitely more problematic than it was 20 or 30 years ago when I first started doing this. So yes, it's uncertainty is the norm, I think, nowadays with the weather up there, and the extremes we experienced are yes, becoming the norm now.
So it wasn't a catastrophically bad year. It's you don't feel the urge to do it again in 2021.
I would love to do it in 2021. There's a few work commitments I might have to shift to do it, but I would jump at it tomorrow if I thought I could get away from the office. But
That sounds like a great idea. I'm a skier myself, but I just bought a boat, so.
yeah. Well, skis do fit on boats if you go to the right places in them, but yeah.
Yeah. No, happy times in Greenland with Bob Shepton and in previous years and stuff. So who knows what the future holds.
Yes, never say never.
I've got to remind the audience, I didn't introduce Clive properly, but he of course looks after our website and database and all manner of things for the Ocean Cruising Club. So he's not allowed any winters off. So sorry about that, Clive. But Bill Weagle has managed to get himself connected to his microphone. Bill, do you want to open your microphone and ask your question again?
Yes, sorry about that. I having a little technical difficulties today. So I don't know if you answered my question, Clive, but I do a bit of backcountry skiing and also cross-country skiing, and I find going downhill on cross-country skis terrifying at times. So if you were to do it again, would you change the type of equipment you used, or would you go with something similar?
No, we would use exactly the same. I mean, yes, it's terrifying going downhill on skis that skinny, but if you took an average day skiing, we would probably spend 7 or 8 hours going uphill or on the flat, and maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes going downhill. And you can always slow yourself down and take some slow lines downhill, but if you've got big heavy skis and plastic boots on, you can't make those lighter when you're going uphill. So no, we would stick with light stuff time and time again, particularly for the Norwegian mountains, where actually most of the time it is you're on the top on a rolling plateau rather than big steep ascents and descents. So yeah, ski mountaineering gear or randonnée gear really doesn't make sense in that environment.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, fascinating trip. Thanks for sharing it.
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
We've got a question from Robert Davis. Robert Davis, do you want to come in? Yep, we can see you. Go ahead. Rob's question, I don't think he's going to come in, but is, did you find a different mental approach between skiing or sailing? There's a good philosophical question for you, Clive. What do you think about that one? Give me 10 minutes to think about that one.
If you'd asked me that in the context of when we did the Greenland crossing, I would say that crossing an ocean and crossing the Greenland ice cap were very similar in terms of the mental things that were needed. You were basically in the same situation. You were on this you were on this one-way escalator. There was no getting off it, whether you liked it or not, and you were completely beholden to the weather. Going through Norway was very, very different from a mental perspective, because we were never even in the most remote parts more than 3 or 4 days hard skiing from being able to get out of something that you didn't want to be in. So that's very different from being stuck in the middle of somewhere where you really can't get out of it if it goes bad. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Rob's giving you the thumbs up. He clearly hasn't got his audio working, but his camera's working, and you've answered it succinctly. Andrew Wilkes, Andrew, do you want to come in?
Really just want to say, Clive, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. We're with Maura's niece, Emma, who wants to know about the navigation in Norway on skis. Do you use conventional maps, or how does that work? Emma?
Yeah, I mean, it was very conventional navigation, paper maps, map and compass. and yeah, very not too dissimilar from you know, how you would navigate across Dartmoor, for example, in the fog and mist, or in any mountain area. Yeah, you ski on a bearing, you take timings, you even count paces. If things got really difficult, we did have a rope and we could rope up, and when you're skiing along, if you've got a 50-meter rope on, you can get someone to put a stripe in the snow, and then the person behind comes by it. So that's a very accurate way of calculating distances, how far you've skied. But it's good old-fashioned navigation. We didn't use GPS. We had a GPS with us, but we didn't use it. Yeah, simply in those sort of temperatures, trying to keep the batteries raised, and this long in the days before you had the maps on them. So, and that wouldn't change it today, I don't think. It's still, that's one aspect that hasn't really changed.
Thank you very much, Clive. It was a brilliant talk. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
We've got a question from Michael Anand Hartshorn. Michael Anand, do you want to come in?
Hi, Clive. Did you build the boat? Did you build the boat?
No, we actually had it built for the trip by Cornish Shrimpers, and yeah, sold it shortly afterwards for several £1,000s more than we paid for it in the end. I mean, shrimpers are vastly overpriced for what they are, but they do hold their second-hand value very well. So it was one of the few good investments I actually made in my life, I think, getting that.
Yeah, we know. We have a friend. We had a very old doctor friend of ours. He had a large one. He built it himself, and we sailed with him quite a lot many years ago. But anyway, okay. No, it worked well considering your hesitation earlier in the week. We enjoyed it. Thanks, lad.
Thank you very much.
It was a very, very pretty boat with those Norwegian mountains behind. Very, very Tillman-esque. Looked fantastic, Clive. I think we
and they're actually fantastically good seaboats. I mean, if you gave me the choice of doing it in a 19-foot Cornish Shrimper or a Bavaria 36 or 38, I would choose the Shrimper every time.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah, great seaboats. A bit like Wayfarers.
Yeah,
go to sea in all.
Super. We'll just ask for one more question. If there's anybody who wants to open their microphone and ask away, there's no more listed. But I think it's probably getting to the time where we have to let Clive off the hook. He's been talking for quite a long time. Does anybody else want to ask Clive any more questions this evening?
How about me, Tony Davies?
Tony Davies.
Can you hear me?
Tony Davies, loud and clear.
Yes.
Yep, fire away, Tony.
I'm very well, and I'd like to send hello to George Curtis, if he's watching. Yeah. Thanks for a lovely show. I'm having difficulty working out the tech as but anyway, great stuff. Hello to Simon and everybody else, anybody who knows me. Give somebody else a chance now. Be quiet. Switch your mic off.
Thank you very much, Tony. Jill and Tony Vasey have got their microphones open and are sitting poised. Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
Tony Vasey, thank you very much, Clive, for a very interesting talk. I've covered a lot of that by air and sea, so I know what I'm talking about. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, good, brilliant.
Clive, I think you've probably had enough. It's been a great evening. Really enjoyed it. Great combination of kind of Tillman-esque adventure, a bit of Riddle of the Sands thrown in, and some lovely sailing in a very picturesque boat. Thank you very much indeed. And don't forget to tune in next week for Bob Comley's account of Tillman himself and his his life, not just his sailing, but his mountaineering, his war record, and his sailing. So thank you, Clive, and good night.